Here is the report on my intermission. I was away from January 17th till March 21st in Berkeley, California, where my partner currently lives. My stated goals were to achieve personal rest and renewal, to complete some work in my DMin dissertation, and to seek spiritual inspiration. I accomplished 2 out of 3 of those goals. Overall, I found that rest was far more needed than I realized, and the intermission was far more spiritually intensive than I ever expected. Because of the pandemic, I remained mostly at my partner's place and spent my time either hiking the hills of Berkeley or just reading a book. Walking is my primary form of prayer, so the simple fact of being able to go for a stroll would have been enough to renew my spiritual well-being. However, I also met with a spiritual director 3 times. I watched 3 to 4 worship videos per week, and a lot of the novels I read discussed spiritual themes. I found myself every day in conversation and debate with God. The intermission was valuable as an opportunity to sort out the spiritual baggage I had accumulated over 15 years of ministry. It created a safe space in which to unpack past grief and wounds, while also addressing some more recent issues in my personal life. In the past year, I've experienced 5 events beyond the pandemic itself that had a major impact on my personal well-being. I'm going to keep those issues private, not because they're salacious, but because they're just mundane enough to be embarrassing. If you really want to know, I'll tell you about them in person, but rest assured it had nothing to do with my partner or with St. Andrews, and you don't need to worry about me. In the end, it's not the personal event that was important, but rather the spiritual reflection that they triggered. This is how it went. In the first 2 weeks of my intermission, I felt enormous guilt about being on an intermission and being out of the country. I left Canada just as our Albertan politicians were caught traveling to Hawaii and other sunny vacation spots. Now, my trip wasn't a casual vacation, but it's hard to explain that to others. And the week I left, Trudeau had warned that new travel restrictions were being considered. Usually when I travel to Berkeley, I step out onto the street, I breathe in the eucalyptus air, and I can feel all the stress immediately melting off my shoulders. This time that didn't happen. I physically escaped the winter, but my heart and mind remained in Alberta. I couldn't keep but think of everyone back home. Even if I couldn't help anyone back there, I felt I should at least be suffering in solidarity with you. My guilt reached a climax when Trudeau announced a $2,000 hotel quarantine. I decided that it was a sign to return home. I rebooked my plane ticket. I took $300 US rapid COVID test. I made arrangements with my roommates, and I said one last farewell to San Francisco. The evening before, with all my bags packed, ready for an early morning flight, I took one last look at the weather in Edmonton. Minus 30 degrees Celsius. In an instant, I could see all the depression, anger, and self-pity that was waiting for me on my return. I canceled my flight. Canceling my return ticket marked a critical shift in my feelings about ministry and guilt. I shared with my spiritual director how guilt has always been a constant companion in my ministry, telling me that I haven't done enough, or that I'm not good enough, or that ministry isn't a job that anyone should be paid for anyways. This trapped me in a cycle of overworking to quiet the negative self-talk. When I canceled my return ticket, I made a conscious decision to refute this guilt, and it changed my internal dialogue. After 15 years of ministry in the PCC, an intermission was owed to me. No one cared that I was still in California. The intermission was intended for rest, and so I will rest. And I won't use my doctoral work as a defense for taking the intermission. Not only did I turn off my social media, I removed it from my phone entirely for the duration of the trip. This break from guilt was so liberating that I continue to feel the effects of it now. It has fundamentally shifted my feelings about the work of ministry and our relationship with the institutional church. The books I read in these first 2 weeks were none, which I don't really feel guilty about. In the weeks that followed my near-home crisis, I felt myself beginning to relax. My goal at this stage was to have a day when I didn't think of Edmonton and I could be present in the moment. I managed to get to that state by the end of the 4th week. In weeks 3 and 4, I felt a particular closeness to God. I spent a lot of time in contemplation on the future of the church and my role as minister. I dreamt about the nature of ministry in the future and contemplated the gifts I could bring to it. Because of the setting of Berkeley and my partner's connection with the Graduate Theological Union, a lot of those thoughts lean towards an interfaith perspective and a broader spirituality. I felt a love of God and a love by God so assuredly that it was only akin to the time that I first realized that God accepted me as a gay man. I started reading a couple books at this stage. Here's a few of them. The Broken Earth trilogy was a winner of the 2016, 2017, and 2018 Hugo Awards for science fiction. It's set in a dystopia future where there's frequent seismic quakes that lead to major climate catastrophes every generation. N.K. Jemisin said in an interview with the CBC that she likes to write a story that centers around someone that looks like her as the protagonist. Large, black, middle-aged, and female. This was the funnest read for me. There was 3 large books in approximately a week, and I carried them with me everywhere. It reminded me of when I was 13 years old and first starting to read and collect my own books, and I read a lot of science fiction stuff by Isaac Asimov, C.S. Lewis, Orson Scott Card, and more. These books, however, never contained characters that I could personally relate to, so it was really refreshing to read a sci-fi action where the main ensemble were primarily women, queer or trans, and people of color, and that those identities were just seamlessly part of the narrative. The trilogy had me reflecting on themes of pain and resilience, generational trauma, and survival. Journey to the East by Hermann Hesse carries the same search for enlightenment themes that made Hesse's novel Siddhartha famous in the West. In Journey, a man reminisces about a mysterious league to which he belonged in his youth. This league was a society of magic and art and music, and serves as, I believe, a metaphor for spirituality and mysticism. The narrator loses contact with the League and longs to return to it. One day he unwittingly bumps into the Grand Master of the League, and through the setting of a trial, he discovers that the League had never left him. Rather, he lost the eyes with which to see the League all around him. This short novel celebrates the mystical beauty that we find in art. I felt challenged by it to reclaim my own love for literature and to accept that we are all characters of our own stories, characters that will outlive our bodies through the memories of others. In week 5, my spiritual euphoria crashed. I had nearly forgotten the personal events of 2020 that had caused me such anguish when another equally distressing event broke the dam and flooded me with doubts and anger at God. Each event on their own was almost inconsequential, yet together they amounted to a crisis of questions about the benevolence of God. I had lost all trust in God. There are a handful of key moments of doubt in my faith journey. They include when, as an elder and director of music, I stopped praying because God had refused to turn me straight, or when, as a new minister at Parkland First, I drove up to Jasper with a handful of atheist books to spend a weekend wrestling with the existence of God. Or, while attending General Assembly, I felt so battered by homophobia that I could not believe God's Spirit was ever with the church. Week 5 of this intermission will be included as one of those moments. This time, I didn't doubt whether God existed. I doubted that God cared. Do we really have a loving God? The question of theodicy, why a good God allows the existence of evil, is of course not new to me, but I have never sat with it as deeply as I did then. I was greatly distressed. The only thing that gave me some comfort was the books that I randomly found in the free little library boxes that week. Most important to me was reading about the Holocaust in Elie Wiesel's Night, and about apartheid in Alan Patton's Cry the Beloved Country. By no means did my suffering compare with those atrocities, but each book articulated theodicy in a way that gave my own pain voice. I cried out to God, not just for myself, but on behalf of all of those who had been tortured and gassed and persecuted, who watched their children die, who loved their God, and yet were never saved from their enemies. How can I preach that God is our refuge when God did not save 6 million Jews? How can I invite people to become followers of Christ when it was followers of Christ who created apartheid? God is supposed to keep us safe. Following God is supposed to lead us to righteousness and justice. And yet, I said to my spiritual director that I could no longer trust God, but I hadn't yet lost faith. My faith held on by the thinnest thread of hope. I was willing to walk away from God. I wasn't willing to walk away from God because I was still holding on to that hope that God might do something, that God might speak to me in some way, that God could answer theodicy. This book was so impactful for me that I believe it should be mandatory reading for every person of faith. If we were still adding books to the biblical canon, I would lobby for this one. It's a fictionalized account of Wiesel's experience in the Auschwitz and Buchenwald concentration camps. It feels like reading the Book of Lamentations, in that it expresses the fervent faith of a people who cry out to a silent God. Like Lamentations, there is a brief moment of faith in the middle, but that's it. There's no moralizing, no answers. God doesn't miraculously save them, and it does not end with the return of faith. In Lamentations, the silence of God is intentional, for if God spoke, God's voice would be so loud that we wouldn't hear the voices of God's people. I think Wiesel is doing a similar thing. We need to hear the pain of the Holocaust without rushing to defend or apologize for God. This book is terrible. Terrible. I held on to it to make sure that it didn't fall into other hands. I would destroy it, but I'm kind of holding on to it as a reference of horrible theology. Everything about it is wrong, but the worst is his surprisingly large chapter in this tiny book, Defending the Devil. Licado misattributes biblical quotes as referring to Satan, and then explains how God uses Satan as a tool to refine us, awaken us, and teach us. Licado doesn't explain how God could use the tool of evil without being evil. If Satan is just following God's instructions, then what's the difference between God and Satan? It's like saying the gun is evil, but the mass shooter isn't. I'd accuse this book of heresy, but I believe its real guilt is lazy writing. If you come across it, shred it. Set in apartheid South Africa, a Zulu pastor, Kumalo, travels to Johannesburg in search for his son. Like the book of Job, this story documents the suffering and loss experienced by a good person of faith. Despite his great faithfulness and devotion, God does not spare this pastor the pain of life. We see Pastor Kumalo devastated and made a shell of himself, desperately clinging to what little faith remains. Then, like Job, blessings return to Kumalo's life, and his faith is reborn. There's no attempt here to address the question of theodicy. Rather, it simply depicts the cycle of faith that we seasonally encounter. This is summed up in the words of a secondary character who says, "I have never thought that a Christian would be free of suffering, Mfundisi, for our Lord suffered, and I come to believe that he suffered not to save us from suffering, but to teach us how to bear suffering. For he knew there is no life without suffering." The next 2 weeks were quiet, as is fitting for a period of spiritual convalescence. I remained angry at God, and I went on many walks to ascertain the exact complaint I was leveling against the divine. I came to the conclusion that either God chose to act with malice, or God chose to be powerless in the face of evil and injustice. Over time, I grew more settled with the idea that, for whatever reason, God does not intervene against injustice and sin. Tragedies are allowed to occur. God might have big, beautiful dreams for us, but God doesn't stop a gunman from snatching away those dreams. For myself, traditional apologetics fails to produce an adequate answer to the problem of evil. But I think I can live with that. Suffering is a mystery. And as angry as I am with God, I still reach out to God, still pray, still hope. With the rest of my faith whittled down to nothing, I found a steely hope at its core. It's a hope that God could still take the broken pieces and mold them into something new. When we have nothing left, we still hope that God might do something. This is the hope that keeps you moving through the valley of the shadow of death, one step at a time. It reminds me of my favorite Bible verse. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. The main character in The Woman of the Pharisees is named Bridget. And if you're a fan of Schitt's Creek, you've already met this character. She's a deeply religious version of Moira Rose. She's very concerned with piety and appearance, a self-righteous busybody who's preoccupied with ensuring everyone else's salvation. In her striving for perfection, she inadvertently ruins the lives of everyone around her, including the local priest. Towards the end of the novel, the priest reflects on his encounter with Bridget, writing, "My mistake and hers are at bottom identical. Both of us have been inclined to believe that it is our duty to interfere in the destinies of those around us. I do not deny that it is the first duty of the sacred office conferred by priesthood to preach the gospel, but that does not mean that we should try to turn our neighbor into a replica of ourselves or force him to see with our eyes." I felt little sympathy or attraction to Mauriac's aristocratic characters. Although Mauriac is a Nobel Prize winner, this particular book felt trapped in its pre-war French setting, with concerns and attitudes that don't translate well to a global audience. Many of us in the church are just as self-righteous as Bridget, but the character is too dated for us to feel convicted by her story. I want to support stories that center women, but in this case, I wish Mauriac had written the main character as a man more like himself. With a bit more honesty and vulnerability, I think this could have been a timeless novel. I love Brian Stevenson. This man is amazing. Just Mercy is the true story of his work as a lawyer defending inmates on death row in Alabama. If you've seen the movie starring Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx, you'll know that the case where Stevenson successfully defended Walter McMillan, who was sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. But Stevenson's work is a lot bigger than that one case. In his book, he documents several cases he worked on, each as upsetting and unjust as that McMillan case. It demonstrates how racially biased the justice system is and how brutal the penal system is. Stevenson and his team fought for people who had no other hope and fought against insurmountable odds. I don't know if he'd accept it, but I would nominate Stevenson for sainthood if I could. It is clear throughout the book that religious faith is a pillar in Stevenson's life. Near the end of the book, after the reader is feeling worn out by these stories of oppression, Stevenson speaks about being broken himself by the years of struggling against inequality, abuse of power, and poverty. When we do the work of bringing about justice and equality, when we stand up to oppression, we get hurt. It will break you. But there is a strength in that brokenness. There's a solidarity with those who know the struggle. There is hope. My final 2 weeks were spent primarily in quarantine while I made the adjustment back to life in Canada. I said to my spiritual director that I felt like I was returning to Canada after getting a spiritual plastic surgery. I was stitched and bandaged and bruised. I knew at this moment that my faith had changed, but until the swelling went down, I wouldn't know for sure what those changes were. In my final days in Berkeley, I felt a new contentment and even a gratitude for God. In my prayers, I found myself, despite myself, thanking God again. No matter how stubbornly I held onto a pout, God made me smile. While I was in quarantine, God filled me with so many dreams that it was uncontainable. New ideas started erupting in my brain, making it impossible to sleep. I was pacing through my room, bouncing from wall to wall with new ministry possibilities, new proposals, new projects. I wrote as much of it down as I could. I don't know if any of these ideas will happen, only time will tell, but it gave me joy to be excited for ministry again. I was getting discouraged with Canada's reads on CBC. It's a book competition. For the past 5 years, I've tried to read the Indigenous Book of the Year. They're often set in the prairies, sometimes with connections to 118th Ave in Edmonton. And I love them. I root for them. And then they get kicked off. I started to give up on Canada Reads. So you can imagine my excitement when I heard that a queer two-spirit Indigenous novel won this year's selection. The first thing I do in the Edmonton airport, even before I pick up my bags, is to buy Johnny Appleseed. The story follows a young two-spirit sex worker in Winnipeg as he plans to trip back to his reserve. The novel is graphic. It's graphic about sex. It's graphic about trauma. It's not a book for everyone. What I liked about it is how visual and tangible it reads. In my ministry, I've known people like Johnny. It felt very real. At the same time, that was my problem with it. Johnny is a fictional character. It's not a memoir. The author makes choices about Johnny and his community that trouble me a bit. I'm hesitant to criticize it, but all I'll say is if you only read one book by a Canadian Indigenous author, I don't think it should be this one. Maybe this should be the second one you read. Like the other books I've read during my intermission, this too had lots of spirituality woven through it. In this case, in a more literal way. Johnny has visions and dreams reflecting on life, death, and the afterlife. What his book excels most at is seeing beauty in brokenness and pain. I started reading this book in week 10 of my intermission, but I'm nowhere close to finishing it. Considering Proust's In Search of Lost Time series did win the Guinness record for longest novel, it might take me a lifetime to finish this book. I think the book is lovely. I've enjoyed it, but it is excruciatingly slow, and that's the point of it. Proust will dwell on a single moment, a sip of tea, a walk to the church, or reading in the garden, and he mines the full artistic beauty of that scene. He writes of the same aristocratic French countryside as Francois Mauriac, except Proust's characters are funny and poignant and raw. For me, this is the perfect way to end my intermission journey. It encourages me to see the artistry and beauty in mundane things, to richly savor each moment, to celebrate the life we have and the ways we are blessed, even in a pandemic. Plus, it's fun to be transported away from snowy Edmonton to a vacation villa in France. As you can see from this report, I had a serious crisis of faith. I'm still not all better. It has left me with a lot of things to ponder and unpack that will take years. But I think that this crisis, those doubts, were so incredibly important to my faith. Sitting deeply with questions and uncertainty didn't destroy my faith, it changed it. I grew. I would like to think that the ways I talk about suffering and faith is now maybe a little more mature than it was 10 weeks earlier. I thank St. Andrew's and the Presbyterian Church in Canada for this gift of intermission. I think I will look back on it as one of the most valuable things that has happened to my spiritual journey. Praise God.